thanks to everyone at the Archives of the Impossible for putting this together. For a lot of us in and from academia who work on the UAP topic, these events are really invaluable because we don't get to do this kind of dialogue in most formal academic spaces, and we don't get to do it in two ways. One is we don't get to get together and have serious intellectual conversation about the subject and the things it's related to, where it's as focused and cohesive as it is at these events, and like the Soul event and other things. But also we have an audience for these events, which is pretty remarkable because it's people coming from so many professional fields and in different institutions and walks of life, who nonetheless want to hear from academics and people with similar expertise, which is pretty rare, right? When you're dealing with something this novel, something this weird, and really in general. Generally, we do our work in very professional spaces. So really, thanks to the audience for being here, really, sincerely. Now, what I'm going to give is really a talk, a lecture in the formal academic sense. So I'd ask from some of you really your patience with that. I will keep it as exciting as possible. I'd ask that, when your mind starts to wander, and trust me, that happens more with the professionals than people that don't do this all the time, let it go to the subject of the talk, because I think that will inspire some things in you that'll make for richer conversation after the talk and in the hallways and out in the courtyard here. Okay, so this talk is called the Corporeal Hypothesis. It's a very deliberate title, and the subtitle is The Matter of Consciousness in NHI Events. Now, in the last decades, the possibility that humanity somewhere has counterparts akin to itself, enough to be its siblings, has undergone a remarkable change of intellectual fortune. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence has found its place in the mainstream of science. The parallel efforts of astrobiologists to detect the signatures of life on potentially habitable planets has attained newfound legitimacy. And UAP, our subject today, are migrating out of the ghettos to which we relegate absurdly strange things. They're entering the city centers of the serious. Whatever the fate of each of these efforts to confirm the existence of what some of us are now calling for convenience, non-human intelligence, or NHI, they've at least opened a moment in which shame and social censure no longer prevent us from allowing our curiosity to publicly entertain the prospect that we live not isolated in an entirely insentient, inorganic, and mostly pre-conscious universe that is in a state of cosmic solitude, but amidst others like us, akin to us, in some respects much like ourselves. As much as it might seem that the study of UAP is far less likely than SETI and astrobiology to yield sufficient evidence or proof that we are not without such siblings, those of us who have long studied the subject are arguably right to think otherwise. It's not just as some of our colleagues in the natural sciences like Avi Loeb and Beatriz Villarroel and others here have recognized that UAP raised the tantalizing prospect that probes from other worlds may be right here, right now, if we can just manage to detect one of them. It's also not simply that the gray literature created by uncredentialed researchers contained a great deal of neglected data attesting to the terrestrial presence of these vehicles. UAP have something much more important going for them than radio signals and biosignatures, which is that most governments having militaries with air forces were forced to reckon with them at some point or another since at least the 1940s. And the United States in particular has begun to make some fulsome acknowledgments that the phenomena are not phenomena at all, but rather instances of a kind of tangible physical object, namely a vehicle, capable of performances that no known or possible aerospace anthropogenic technology is. The fact that voices from the US government have been both directly and elusively saying just that over the last decade ought to embolden us with confidence that non-human intelligences are less possibility than actuality, and that we may soon recognize this enough to be, as Alexander Wendt recently suggested, the last generation to imagine ourselves to be alone. Now, despite all this, we have avoided, almost as though it were too uncanny for us to contemplate, the possibility that there are other non-human or post-human forms of life, if life would even be the right word, on the vehicles. This isn't to say that this is nowhere on the minds of anyone paying even occasional attention to, at this point, regular news about the latest congressional action concerning the UAP presence, as the prospect of ET visitation is precisely what intrigues the non-obsessed public. It's rather that we have barely broached in public discourse an obvious possible consequence of the UAP presence, which is that it may very well entail as well the presence of aliens in the sense of being somewhat or largely different than us, but enough like us to need vehicles to arrive at and function here, and at least indirectly interact with and effectively communicate with us. When former National Reconnaissance Office officer David Grush went public about his formal whistleblowing complaint with the United States Inspector General of the intelligence community, the part of his allegations that sparked ridicule was far less that crashed UAP had been retrieved and studied by components of the U.S. intelligence community than his claim that some contained the remains of deceased NHI, or by a slightly bastardized word that he popularized, biologics. That prospect is, in principle, no more implausible or unreasonable than that of so-called alien craft, and yet it strikes many as preposterous to the point of being delusional. Among people serious intellectually about UAP and the topic's enthusiasts, there's yet another problem that prevents us from pondering the possible presence of NHI, which is that it is not some undefined non-human intelligence, but rather an extraterrestrial or some other kind of living, or at least embodied, quasi-anthropomorphic being. That is the popular image of an alien that is evoking psychological aversion, where wonder, curiosity, and a desire for answers about who designs and makes, if not operates and travels in UAP should prevail. We often find exaggerated disinterest and even protest. This has no more basis in reason than the general educated outrage about aliens, but it also lacks another floor, strangely enough, that its defenders claim for it, which is evidentiary support. Despite what might be expected, there's an excess of credible testimony to support the possibility that UAP vehicles indeed are accompanied by the individuated beings that the first generations of academic, government, and non-credentialed researchers termed occupants, be they pilots or passengers. Simply put, there is much to suggest that UAP indeed come accompanied by quasi-anthropomorphic beings that I will, to avoid presumption about what they are, generically refer to as others, and which demand of us more imagination than we have so far mustered if we were to begin to fathom what they are, to decide whether they're selves of a kind similar to us. I will, in what follows today, outline the reasons for our neglect of these others, make a case for why we should reverse it by inquiring as fully into them as we do UAP themselves, and most crucially, offer not a new concept, but a new feeling for the so-called NHI responsible for many UAP. My ambition is to help us to begin to imagine and conceive the disposition and content of thought that we would call their minds and subjectivity, and that is often imagined to be an ineffable and transcendent consciousness. To do this, though, I will also take what some may find to be a counterintuitive approach to those others, which is to turn our questioning away from their consciousness and its supposed intangibility, and toward what are, at least by appearances, their bodies. For reasons that will become apparent as we go, I will call the idea guiding here my line of thought the corporeal hypothesis, even if it ultimately concerns thought, consciousness, and subjectivity as much as the body. Why I do this will become apparent as we move between empirical and ontological issues to begin to answer, which I will do as a philosophically oriented anthropologist, the question, what are the so-called NHI we associate with UAP? Now, understand that my proposal is likely to incite controversy and perhaps resistance in today's public UAP conversation. For some natural scientists and humanists, the very notion that there is any evidence at all for these human-like others will seem inaccurate, unverifiable through quantifiable data, and unsupported by scholarly research. While some fraction of academia and government who are decidedly UAP forward will join the broader swath of the advocates and say that I'm saying nothing new, but instead shying away from the far stranger and more challenging dimensions of the UAP presence that overlap again with certain vexing aspects of religious experience or the new physics of consciousness. In between them, some researchers, many of whom predate the post-2017 period, will feel that I'm encouraging the conversation to regress by crudely and prematurely putting the dreaded ET hypothesis back on the table in favor of either the study of purely material vehicles or psi phenomena that also may travel with UAP. Although no one finds the other, almost no one finds the others themselves, at least those that witnesses to them declare to be tangible and thus physical, to be a genuine and high-stakes problem. I'd insist, however, that we consider the prospect of the existence of these others, and not because pure argument leads us to them, but rather, again, because people who have had up-close experiences of UAP do, and they thereby provide us with the empirical justification for our work. This should come as no surprise to anyone seriously engaged with UAP, as the to-date best cinematic and perhaps aesthetic representation of the science and culture of UAP was no less a film than Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which the director named in honor of both the astronomer and chief Blue Book scientific consultant J. Allen Hynek, and the term he coined for the experiences of ordinary people with apparent UAP occupants. Spielberg gives us a dramatic portrayal of one type of third kind close encounter, abductions, that was unknown to the astronomer when he developed the typology. But his film also neglects some other subtypes already familiar to other scientific researchers and investigators, and that would become more well-known subsequently. These include beings seen staring, sometimes forebodingly, at observers from ships, exiting from or fleeing to those that have landed, or communicating with human witnesses before re-entering and departing them, or even sometimes repairing them on the ground. Now, almost all such encounters, with only the rarest of exceptions, involve the others, the quasi-anthropomorphs. New Mexico State Police Officer Lonnie Zamora is in Socorro, New Mexico, with two short clothed beings outside an egg-like UAP vehicle, is the most well-known of a larger group of investigated cases that includes, to name just a few, those in Valençol, France, Boinoy, Papua New Guinea, and Cisco Grove, California. Some see a hapless human unexpectedly crossing paths with short, large-headed, large-eyed, and long-armed beings that match the description of so-called grays. But in plenty of others, the humanoids encountered are quite different. Diminutive people attributed physical traits such as Asiatic eyes or ordinary human faces that inconveniently put them outside that presumed type. Perfectly human-looking beings with Scandinavian, or in rarer cases, South Asian or African features. The same descriptions recur in the thousands of such accounts that were received and sometimes investigated in the 50s, 60s, and 70s by non-academic researchers, ufologists, and enthusiasts. But these also expanded the bestiary to include, for instance, dwarves covered in thick, shaggy fur encountered in Venezuela in the 1950s, and still weirder things, like a faceless being, bipedal, who demonstrated to an Ecuadorian witness its non-sexual method of reproduction by bifurcation. By the 1980s, reports of abductions by so-called grays became increasingly common, but they displaced neither the other commonly reported kinds nor the rarities and singularities. The former was also expanded in that and subsequent decades by people recounting run-ins and abductions by exceedingly tall insect-like creatures and tall albino human-like beings. In the encounter narratives, finally, of American Indian, First Nations, and Central American Native peoples that R.D. Six-Killer Clark gathered and published in her remarkable quartet of books, one reads not only of these and all the previous major kinds of humanoids, but also even weirder things, such as apparent material simulations of humans and gigantic blue figures. Despite the diversity, over and over, we hear of bodies. Yet for as almost innately intriguing those testimonials are, they scarcely keep our interest today. From the 50s through the 80s, reports of humanoid occupants were usually taken not even as evidence, but as obvious confirmation of the presumably extraterrestrial origins of UAP, and thus as a source of information about them. But this began to be rejected as a sort of vulgar common sense as John Mack's abductions and Strieber's communion introduced the idea that the space from which the others come may be more as much inner and noetic as outer and physical, and the others themselves of an even more enigmatic nature. This set the stage for what I believe to have been the more decisive factor in the others passing almost into oblivion, which was the eventual popularization around the mid-2000s of Jacques Vallée's conception of a wider UAP phenomenon, of which apparent vehicles are a primary but by no means sole aspect, and that also consists of spiritual visions and apparitions, exotic psi phenomena, and troubling synchronicities. That's left many of our most audacious thinkers and researchers focused on a broad range of anomalous and often psychical phenomena, and strangely indifferent to the often intractable solidity of not only UAP, but the others. We have shifted our gaze from something that may not fit into our conception of reality to something we imagine to be capable of decisively shaping, altering, engineering, and even simulating reality from a higher dimensional or at least imperceptible space. And the experiences of the experiencers, the super experiencers, and even the would-be prophets of contact are being used to suggest that an enigmatic, godlike, disembodied consciousness lies behind UAP, which would then be a screen, a lure, a deception. The UAP would be instruments by which we are being reprogrammed as a species, and they're not at all what they seem to be. Next to the dazzling flashes of that supposed elusive consciousness, the pallor of little gray men holds little appeal. Now, it's to some degree this neglect of world-changing matter that leads me to address it when scarcely anyone else is. But what's truly of interest here is the intellectual quandary that lies behind this neglect, which is that UAP constitute an enormous ontological problem. And they do so because they overspill the categories that we have imagined in the last centuries of our modernity to be the primary or the only modalities of being. As I'm far from the first person to point out, obviously, much thorough and unprejudiced study of UAP arrives at the same perspective as that often held by people who have undergone intense or repeated experiences of them. The vehicles often seem to be not only the sort of entities that ordinary descriptive language would call physical objects, but also, almost or just as equally, entities or beings of thought, or for some, spirit. Even those events in which UAP leave in their wake indelibly physical traces also demonstrate that their greatest effects are perplexing perceptual and noetic anomalies. Yet despite how well known this apparent paradox is, by Vallée's dictum, it's that the UFO has a simultaneously physical and psychic nature. Most of us thinking about UAP have done a poor job of reckoning with, let alone trying to define, the problem it raises. It may surprise some here to know that I think that we are failing at that because we have not gone far enough ontologically. Most of us do not suffer from timidity about questioning what reality as we conceive of it truly is, and if our concepts are wrong, might instead be. Many of the most engaged participants of the UAP conversation embrace the possibility that consciousness or thought or the soul belong as much to reality as their imagined opposites of matter and nature. And they find little difficulty in noticing and accepting the noetic aspects of UAP events and or those involving the others. Yet reckoning with the ontological challenge these entities bring, or to be more precise, reckoning with these ontologically, demands more from us than simply affirming and asserting that certain things are or could be far more real than science and the other institutions of our age deem them to be. To some of us who practice it, the last thing we consider ontology to be is a simple theory of reality, particularly if it is a prescriptive one righteously promulgated by the self-assured. We think instead that ontology is something quite different indeed, a methodical art of thinking about everything that is, if what everything is, or rather that it is at all, cannot be conceived and named using a single master concept, if we genuinely want to grasp it. By a simpler but more difficult formula, ontology is the method of thinking about what the being of that everything is, if no category or conception of that everything can be the same as that being, or the fact that everything is at all. Thus, to someone committed to this art, to assert that reality is consciousness or thought is to miss the point and reproduce the very problem that we try with ontology to deal with in the first place. that the being of things is different than the concepts we use to understand it. To say that UAP revealed to us that everything is, that its being is consciousness, or quantum fields, or God, or spirit, or ideas, is to avoid rather than confront them as an ontological problem. Now, this proposition may challenge some of my listeners and cause some to ask why we should be trifling with something as difficult as ontology. My response takes us back to the others, and is to say that we are having some difficulty in perceiving and thinking about them precisely because we are overly, sometimes obsessively focused on what we think they suddenly reveal or fail to about reality or being. We are split between minimizing the challenges they raise to our modern, physicalist, and materialist cosmology by declaring these to be without evidentiary merit and beyond the interest of science. And on the other hand, we exaggerate the degree to which they might resolve those challenges by assuming that their most bizarre aspects vindicate a religious or spiritual cosmology because they're primarily of a largely unrecognized spiritual or noetic nature. Some, that is, are unwilling to countenance the abundant testimony of UAP witnesses about psi and noetic phenomena, while others among us are listening to but not necessarily hearing what UAP encounters tell us about everything from physics and technology to biology and sociality and politics, which also raises issues about what reality is and exposes the complexity of the overall problem they form. That is, very few of us are dealing with the range of modes of being touched by and put into question by UAP encounters, and that lie, at least before we practice ontology, between the opposed pairs of matter and mind, or physicality and thought, to which most of the debate currently reduces. It's there, between those supposed poles, that we find the others, and some clues about their nature. Now, I say this again not because argument alone leads us to them, but rather and much more because people who have had up-close experiences of UAP do, and they thereby provide us with the empirical motive to inquire further. None of the celebrated researchers to whom we owe the insight that the broader phenomena is as noetic as physical ever contended that the ostensible occupants were not as well. And their work is full of narratives from the 50s through the 70s of apparent aliens communicating telepathically with witnesses, probing their memories, and directly transmitting, as it were, religious, scientific, and historical knowledge to them without any recognizable mediation. Such reports, moreover, did not trickle off in the 80s and 90s, but rather flowed more, as John Mack, Thomas Bullard, and others began publishing on abductions and events like the Ariel school landing. And in case we are tempted to relegate stories of these anthropomorphs to those decades, my own ongoing research leads me to agree both with certain investigators and many witnesses, indicating that the others are still encountered today. I not only have spoken recently, for instance, to someone who, after encountering a luminous nighttime UAP, woke up to find so-called grays at his bedside, but others experiencing regular waking interactions with them. To begin to make better sense than we so far have of what these beings might be, we need first to revisit and examine, in light of such data, the merits of some suppositions that have led us to be less curious about them than some inscrutable consciousnesses purportedly animating them. I think that the most relevant of those suppositions for our purposes come from Vallée's case in Passport to Magonia, The Invisible College, and subsequent books like Dimensions, Confrontations, and Revelations, that the ET hypothesis obfuscates not just the evidently double psychic noetic character of UAP, or physical noetic character of UAP, but also the resemblance between their humanoid occupants and the supernatural beings of European and other folktales. Starting with Passport to Magonia, Vallée demonstrated the bizarre aerial phenomena that are in certain respects like UFOs, turned up in medieval, early modern, and still more recent religious folktales and strange chronicled events from the Middle Ages, and that one of the recurring traits of these phenomena is their accompaniment by weird, often diminutive beings much like those believed to pilot the ships. The conclusion that Vallée draws from this resemblance is, of course, not simply his well-known claim that UAP in the common sense are by no means phenomena exclusive to the 20th century, but appear as well in other previous centuries. Rather, this self-described heretic among heretics additionally argues that the striking resemblance between the UAP and UAP humanoids on the one hand, their past counterparts on the other, suggests that they are unlikely to be not only extraterrestrials as they were conceived mid-century, but anything in the realm of the anticipatable. In short, UAP and to some extent the others too are for Vallée not tangible objects per se, but mythological symbols that a grand intelligence existing outside time and space has conjured into our consciousness to teach and improve Homo sapiens. The others would exist outside nature as we conceive it. In other words, they would be supernatural, and their modes of being would be outside inquiry. Now, there are a few reasons for us to question this idea, which I will name for convenience the supernatural hypothesis, and they come down to the reported physicality and corporeality of the others. So much in the testimony about UAP and their occupants suggests that it would be an exaggeration to say that both are indistinguishable from the supernatural beings of folktales, and thus not solely or ultimately the physical supports of myth. One such aspect of note from the testimony is the fact that witnesses themselves spontaneously or upon questioning differentiate between UAP vehicles and ghosts, as well as other liminal supernatural entities. A 30-something Bay Area resident who found himself gazing from the Marin headlands at a disk that appeared over the Pacific Ocean told me, for instance, that the object was obdurately tangible and present in space, and he contrasted this with a ghost that he once encountered and reckoned to be perceptible only visually and obliquely, and to have no physical location per se. This common enough perception of the palpable physicality of UAP does not preclude, obviously, that they have psychical and noetic dimensions, but it greatly complicates their assimilation to the wheels of medieval religious visions and other wonders in the skies of past eras. Accounts of humanoid occupants prove more challenging to the supernaturalist hypothesis, to the point that it can find itself in jeopardy. This is first of all due to their heterogeneity and at times unclassifiable character. The diversity and at times singularity of the human-like kinds found in these accounts do not by themselves pose more of a problem for the supernatural hypothesis than any other, but they do once it's noticed that we need but lack both a sure, reliable taxonomy of the occupant types and a counterpart classification of mythological beings to test the hypothesis. Absent both things, it's entirely unclear which ETs there would be and which supernatural beings they are supposed to be identical with. In other words, we're left with trying to reconcile, so to speak, the 5 kinds of aliens presumed in much popular UAP discourse with an unbounded list of barely definable supernatural beings, from jinn to angels and saints to bodhisattvas to divinities to animal spirits. Until we do that work for both kinds of beings, it makes little sense to contend that they form a single type. This is a big enough issue for the supernatural hypothesis applicability and supposed generality, but its very plausibility is also threatened by another aspect of the testimony from encounters with the others. It's by no means infrequent for witnesses to provide lucid, rich descriptions of the physicality of the occupants. Not just broad, generic statements about their ostensible forms and physiologies, but precise and sometimes unmistakably lived descriptions that would be difficult to give of a spectral being. Simply put, we hear accounts of meetings of not just minds, but bodies. A remarkable event from the late 1980s, recounted to me by a woman, now in her 80s, illustrates the point. Already the subject of a related childhood encounter, during which she and her father watched for an hour a disc before 3 others joined it and entered an apparent carrier vehicle. Marianne, as I'll call her, awoke in her late 40s to find 3 short, large-eyed beings that she said entirely matched the images of so-called grays, along with a much taller, nearly ordinary figure whom she said looked like a normal man when he approached her bed to address her. Over 3 conversations with me in as many years, Marianne stated that she was immediately struck by the texture of his clothing, which at first seemed to her to be his skin because it clung perfectly to every contour of his body. It was as if he was dipped in rubber. You could see every muscle. As the normal man told her telepathically, she says, that they hadn't found what they were looking for and wouldn't be coming back, she sensed the urgency and disappointment of someone who had failed at an important task, and she also sensed empathy. Lucid and extremely, extremely clear in her memory, Marianne is convincing when she says that she met an enigmatic person in the flesh. Now, if physical bodies there are, we gain at least a little clarity about what we might be dealing with. Should we accept that such narratives of embodied persons are accurate, it nonetheless does not follow that these enigmatic bodies are not those of the beings from traditionally conceived supernatural encounters any more than they would be of so-called aliens. The implication is instead that we simply do not know anything about where the bodies come from and to whom they belong. Questions of origin and identity are unanswerable at this point, and that applies as much to those that might be imagined to be supernatural as those that could be extraterrestrial. This does not help anyone favoring the ET hypothesis, but it leaves the supernaturalist hypothesis in worse shape than it was before, as its advocates are forced not only to furnish a clear list of the beings that the others are supposed to be, again, a very difficult task, but to examine more contemporary reports and tales of spirit world denizens and compare them with those of the UAP humanoids. Given the difficulty of that, we have better hope of making some sense of these others if we restrict our inquiries to recent and contemporary data concerning them. So much of that data takes us even further toward the others' bodies and through them to something else, the subjectivity and consciousness of the others, and the chance we might have of making sense of it ontologically. Now, the likely physicality of these others, this is what I mean by the corporeal hypothesis, becomes even more evident in light of another aspect of the encounter narratives, which is that they are replete, and have been since their beginning, with accounts and evidence of communication. In brief, witnesses recount that the beings not only send intentional and sometimes explicit messages, but engage in behavior and take actions laden with intelligible meaning. Communication of this kind, communication as we mostly know it, of the sort that occurs between living, corporeal, sentient, and subjective beings, whether human or animal, is the strongest indication that the others are unlikely to be wholly other, from an uninvestigatable realm, but enough like us to move through their existence with bodies. If we owe serious consideration to this possibility, it's not because it could somehow ever account for the many aspects of UAP and NHI encounters that it suggests that something is amiss in our immediate perception and understanding of both things, if not of reality as we conceive it. Indeed, the psychical and noetic dimension of encounters remain and must be reckoned with, despite the difficulties they raise. The stakes of inquiring into the apparent and perhaps actual corporeality of these others, then, is instead just the opposite. It provides us with some leverage on the vexing enigma of why their minds, thoughts, and consciousnesses seem to be what is most interesting about them. In other words, and now I will again ask us to slow down and ponder some difficult issues, it's by means of thinking about bodies that we can finally deal with the ontological problem of the others. The point of saying that the educated conversation is thought erroneously that ontology is about arguing for this or that theory of reality. It was not to saddle the discussion with excess intellectualism. By practicing a bit of ontology and proceeding as though no concept can be used to conceptualize the being of everything, we can discern when specific beings form problems for us because they immediately, again, overspill the categories and modalities in which we try to place them. Just as crucially, ontological thinking disposes us to conceive of the solution to our problem, not as resolution of the issue of what a thing is, or through absolution of and from the problem of what everything is, but instead through a dissolution of our certainty about the applicability of our categories and attempt to get distance from and think them. We end up here disposed not to say that the others are this or that kind of being, or that the testimony about them supports this or that theory of reality, but rather to suspend our certainty or confidence about those modalities and puzzle through what these confounding beings might be. Ontology tells us their apparent corporeality provides an occasion to step back from our thinking about reality rather than remain self-satisfied. And this also reveals to us more about their nature and their subjectivity than it seems. Some varieties and instances of UAP and apparent NHI communication, to come back to that, helps us see this. It may be surprising that the first such variety to demand our attention is not as direct as Marianne's experience of a speaking being, but certain UAP themselves and the reported behavior. I'm going to, for time's sake, make this point quickly, which is that we encounter often in certain UAP accounts, particularly those involving direct attempts at interception or military engagement, measures that appear to be defensive on the part of the UAP. And I think that's an indication that self-preservation is in play with the potential occupants, so that's a more likely explanation than something like AI. Now, this indication that we may have biological beings on board the vehicles goes as well for the countless narratives of communication from and with the others themselves. But this also brings us right before the ontological problem. In account after account, witnesses of the likes even of Lonnie Zamora see the beings making haste for landed vehicles. This too is consistent with the impulse for self-preservation of living and thus mortal beings, with the same going for the many narratives of witnesses who report being temporarily disabled or paralyzed by anthropomorphs who attempted to approach them. All such tales are of de facto and sometimes intentional communication, no matter how silent, and they cry for us to ask if the responsible agents are beings that are alive and thus as mortal and as finite as us, rather than gods or pure consciousnesses of unlimited existence. It's no secret that most firsthand accounts of this find the narrator astonished to realize that statements they'd initially believed to be spoken were being received in their minds rather than by their ears and delivered without visible use of mouths. Marianne, who says that the normal man spoke to her telepathically, is just one among some of the likely thousands of such cases of reported immediate communication that count notorious events like the Ariel event. Such cases seem to suggest, of course, that nothing physical, let alone biological, could be responsible for them. Yet there's an abundance of cases in which the same dubious bodies that seem to emit noetic messages also give off signs of an unmistakably physical kind. The NHI gesture. Before turning to the significance of this for our hypothesis, let me adumbrate some instances of it. In J. Ellen Hynek's review of the 1959 Benoit boarding school's student bodies observations of a disk floating over the Pacific Ocean, he emphasizes the headmaster's testimony that one of the alleged occupants waved. Corel Lorenzen writes of a Brazilian agronomist and his family's 1954 encounter near Porto Alegre with two long-haired men emerging from a landed disc and approaching their car with arms raised. Valet notes a Peruvian workers' 1965 meeting with a large-headed being that emerged from an oval object and gestured unintelligibly. And he also notes a teenager's run-in in Argentina with two white-haired men who mentioned to him before giving him a written message. They motioned to him, and then they left in an elliptical craft. Finally, RD6 killer Clark re-narrates accounts of tall, inhuman beings associated with the vehicle, pointing upward when queried on his origins, and of another that pointed to indicate his interest in taking a witness's dog away on a nearby landed vehicle. Now, to anyone unacquainted with fields like linguistics and semiotics, such images of gesturing anthropomorphs may seem trivial or insignificant. Yet as anyone who has ever struggled to make himself intelligible to people not sharing his language, gesture is always potentially, and sometimes actually, a universally intelligible form of expressivity among human beings. This is due, to gloss in a few words, a topic that has engendered its own literature, to Homo sapiens' development of language some millions of years after its antecedents formed hands, digits, and opposable thumbs, as well as the delay of infants in acquiring the capacity for speech. More profoundly, the familiarly, immediately intelligibility of gesture also derives from its power to compensate for the ambiguity, tedious delays, and failures of achieving and comprehending meaning through spoken words. Anger, confusion, and exasperation all can be conveyed straight away and unequivocally with upturned hands. We rational animals find more clarity in our bodies than language. Now, none of that should at all assure us that any or all of the others are just as animal as we are, children of evolution that remain bound by its glacial pace and environmental constraints. Yet the strange fact of their use of gesture demands explanation, and a quite plausible one is that some of them resort to it because it is among their semiotic capacities, and is so because their modes of being include embodiment and physicality as we immediately think of them. The questions of why and how those bodies would have come to be and what they consist of may be presently unanswerable, but that in no way prevents us from considering this possibility and letting it guide our analyses and interpretations. In fact, the corporeal hypothesis helps us to content ourselves with questions we stand a chance of addressing rather than those about origins and essences. Now, this gives us at last some insight into the other's nature and subjectivity. Our point of departure was the problem of why we can manage a public conversation about UAP, but falter when it veers toward aliens. At this point, we can say that this is at least partly because we have only poorly reckoned with the evidence for these others. Apart from having grossly overlooked that experience shows that the others indeed may be embodied, we may have, by doing so, also neglected what this may tell us about the nature of their subjectivity, in the sense of their kind, or more likely, kinds of selfhood, mindedness, and cognitive orientation. It seems, so the corporeal hypothesis suggests, that their subjectivity is not, or not always, of a wholly other kind than ours. Our kind and their kind may be of a kind significantly commensurate in our subjectivity. What else does their corporeality show to justify such speculation? For starters, the others may share at times other modes of communication with us, which are, strangely enough, spoken language, writing, and iconic symbols. More instances of each of these semiotic modes turns up in the literature than can be examined. So suffice it to mention those of undecipherable languages heard by and even spoken to humans, the proverbial hieroglyphic characters seen in the ships, and emblems on them and the other's clothing. These modes may not frequent the reports as much as gesture, but they turn up in even a few of the most well-known of the best investigated events. Language and writing, as any student of the humanities knows, are so distinctively, so quintessentially human that their appearance among the ostensibly non-human entails either that the data is all wrong and mere fantasy, or that we have further reason to consider that the physicality of at least some of the others makes them biological, like us, and, more astonishingly, that they also could be social, like us. Now, we should, if we're going to keep getting somewhere, pause and even stop. Putting so simply that there is evidence that the others might be social, like us, implies that they are also political, cultural, technological, like us. That they might have not only their own forms of, say, kinship, but also of law, economy, and the state. It would be to say that these supposed non-humans are effectively humans, much like us. We can all agree that we should not go too fast, pretending that we can resolve astrobiological and other scientific debates on the basis of obscure, fragmentary data. Yet there's another reason, more important than analytic and intellectual sobriety, to not push the analogy too much. The prospect of people who speak, read, and write, and yet are not people in any known or conventional sense, is a problem deserving our contemplation, rather than a fact pregnant with its own proof. Similitude, that's strange, is a problem for the same reason that it exemplifies the incredible in the first place. Our most everyday sense of our being, the baseline feeling we have of existence, is that we, the human species, come without perfect doubles and find nowhere another bearing to us a striking resemblance. Science refuses this, philosophy disparages it, governments give little thought to it, and most of us cannot imagine it anyway. Yet there stand our likenesses, others not other enough to be fully alien, doing, saying, and making things, just as we do. More same than other, at least by their image. To think about this, we have to first let the problem be a problem long enough to expose its insolubility, let it linger in its virtual impossibility. We should allow ourselves to be as reticent about conclusive haste, as receptive as we already are to the likelihood of the improbable. Intellectual patience and dissatisfaction serve us as much here as interpretive imagination, and they can empower us to accept the quandary of the human-like non-human while not deciding it to be unthinkable. So let's look at the issue from the other way around, remembering to do so ontologically. To name it, our unresolvable problem is at bottom whether and in what way they and we might be of the same kind. Most such problems about kinds, genres, and species, if this and that are instances of a kind, are similarly unamenable to lasting solution, as their analysis requires and can never be extricated from their interpretation. This one is especially so. Each of the elements composing it is particularly subject to interpretation, since every possible interpretation concerns the interpreter himself. And the interpreter, meanwhile, already faces the same problem when it comes to understanding himself. Anything we might discover to be like us about the others would be accompanied by things making them unlike us or rejected for being not at all like us. Anytime we try to draw the contrast or make the comparison with them, we would at best say that we and they are to some extent, almost entirely, somewhat, barely or not at all, alike. It would depend on how and whether we define the kinds. Now, if this is already the case when we try to distinguish between human cultures, then it all the more applies to non-human others. Even if it were to be suddenly discovered that we are in many respects their spitting image and vice versa, highly similar biosocial, technological, ethical, and noetic beings whose evolution and history run at points in parallel, some fundamental aspects of us and them, are in their values, our organizing symbols and theirs, are in their cognitive orientations, are in their emotional tonality, would nonetheless lack counterparts. Our dearth of anything resembling knowledge about the others, however, might make expectation of even that degree of non-correspondence misguided. It could be that they, or some of them, hold extremely disorienting experiences and conceptions of reality, rather than anything we would presently or innately find intelligible or cognitively tolerable. Collective consciousness without individuality, not measuring time or perceiving a divisible present, and historical stasis born from unimaginable longevity are among the possibilities some consider, while others among us imagine autonomous, hyper-advanced, ASI, and even higher dimensional existence. Our likenesses in these cases might be so unlike us as to provide only deceiving or unrecognizable images. Indifferent to our speculations, corporeality nonetheless remains a trait of the others. Whatever sort of beings they might in truth be, they continue to present, or simply to exist, with bodies. This makes them more than just confounding presences due to their utter strangeness and opacity. Their offensively improbable, exquisitely animated corpses makes the others indeed not completely other, but in some way commensurate. No matter the extent of their dissimilarity from us, nor how much it could lead us to place them beyond the pale of the same, those bodies establish at least a thin margin of commonality with us, a shared existential format that guarantees that their existence and mentality, however ineffable it might seem, is minimally intelligible, amenable to at least elementary comprehension. Whatever the degree of their alienness, they would be like us enough to be, in some way, still the same. So let's imagine, even interpret in that light, their subjectivity. If we should decide that the other's apparent bodies are nothing more than instruments or interfaces enabling them to interact with us, the need to resort to these tells us that their consciousness is far from omniscient and omnipotent, however wide its scope, and still in need of prostheses to supplement its failings of knowledge and capacity. That in turn would imply, moreover, that they are enough like us to reckon with distinct modalities of reality or being, to be beset by the difficult work of understanding beings that exceed their categories. They, too, would deal with the vexing problem of being, and that would make the nature of their consciousness fathomable. No matter how beyond physicality as we know it they might be, they too would be at a distance, unable to discern or master the character of everything. If we can imagine that minds so powerful or so grand face ontological predicaments, then we should have less trouble imagining that not all the others are so vastly different. Not all likenesses are illusion or slight, and many must be scrutinized to find the disparities between them. Our improbable doubles, those unbelievable mirrors, could, in actuality, be our kin. Thank you.